Good evening. Today I'd like to tell you, by way of an introduction, about the Battle of Otterburn. There'll be quite a lot going up on various platforms in the next few weeks and months because a lot of exciting things are happening around the old Otterburn battlefield, which is or forms part of the very exciting Revitalising Weedsdale programme. And you'll be hearing a lot more about that from the Battlefields Trust and from the Southern National Parks, and indeed the other partners in this project. My job tonight is to tell you a little bit about the battle itself. Now, part of the project, will focus on battlefield archaeology, actually conducting excavations to try and identify or fix positions of various parts of the action, because it has to be said, there's a lot of disagreement. The primary sources, the major sources, Froissart himself, are not by any means clear, and most of the secondary sources, or a lot of them, disagree on several cardinal points, which I'll try very briefly tonight to actually clear up, or at least to provide some pointers. This battle was fought on the 5th or 19th of August, depending on how you interpret the dates, and fought between a large Scottish raiding force around 3,000 strong, commanded by the Earls of March and Douglas. They were opposed by a much stronger force, perhaps twice as many, under Sir Henry Percy, Hotspur, the son of the Earl of Northumberland. So the Scots were working to a carefully formulated strategy for that year's campaign. The expedition by March and Douglas was essentially a feint, a diversion. They would strike rapidly down the east coast, moving fast, hitting hard, pinning the defenders in their castles and in Newcastle. The defenders were intended to think that this was the main Scottish invasion, and that the Scots had come across the border in very significant force. In fact, the opposite was true. The main Scottish force would strike down the west side. Now, as events panned out, the events in the west were pretty insignificant, and the main action occurred in the east. It is said that the Scottish officers planned their final tactics at Sudenkirk, just on the far side of the border, where, although they were overheard by an English spy, the spy, when he came to ride south with his news, found that his horse had been stolen. A bit inconvenient, and he was soon rumbled. We're not quite sure what happened to him, but I'm sure it was nothing good. The plan worked perfectly. These lightly armed hobblers, these were light cavalry. They didn't have extensive baggage trains or supply lines. They moved fast, they struck hard, they could cover large distances, and they could drive herds of captured livestock, mainly black cattle, back at a fairly phenomenal rate. Nobody said war couldn't be profitable. Although there was a strategic purpose to this raid, it was still a raid, and all of the captains and all of the men-at-arms would be hoping to get their fair share of the spoils. This is pretty normal. The Scots penetrated as far south as Durham, burning, killing, laying waste, providing panic, creating panic, and convincing the Earl of Northumberland and his vainglorious and hot-headed son Hotspur that they were facing a far larger force than was the case. Now, legend asserts, and we can take a view on this as to whether we believe it or not, that in front of the wooden barrier, which was an outwork to the Barbican, now the Black Gate in Newcastle, Hotspur and Douglas actually fought each other. They broke lances. And it seems that Douglas had slightly the better of the contest and was able to make off with Percy's pennon. Now, this is pretty significant. If you lose your pennon, then, well, it's a black mark. It's dishonor. And chivalry legend, and Froissart, of course, was playing to a chivalric audience, assert that Hotspur was on fire to regain his pennon. Nonetheless, Douglas retraced his steps towards the border with extreme care. They attacked and burnt Ponteland Tower, taking the Castellan prisoner, and they retreated via Cambro, through Elsdon. We assume through Elsdon, there are different views on that, of course, to Otterburn itself, where they probably made camp about a mile and a half or so north of the actual Otterburn Tower. Otterburn Tower was a medieval castle. It was a hold of the Umfreville family, and it's said to have been surrounded or having been in a marsh. So clearly there was low-lying alluvial swampland on the banks of the Reed, which is exactly what you would expect at the time. And of course, near the castle, the Otterburn discharges into the Reed itself. This ground was wet. Douglas was intent on taking Otterburn Castle as well, but for 3 days they tried, and for 3 days they were frustrated, which certainly suggests the castle had perhaps more defences than simply those created by the Umbravilles. The Scottish camp, then. It's helpful, if you're listening to this, if you have a copy of the Ordnance Survey, the 2.5 inch to the mile map, which is the 1 to 25,000 scale, and the sheet I'm working for is NY89, big old-fashioned that way. Now that shows you where Otterburn lies, of course, bottom right-hand corner. It shows you the line of the current A696, which indeed probably was the road at that time, which leads northwards until it reaches a fairly narrow pass. And if you're heading north, Greenchester's farm is on your right-hand side. On the hillside above is Greenchester's camp. Now, this is an Iron Age fort, nothing to do with the medieval era at all, but it may be this is where Douglas and the bulk of the men-at-arms made their camp. Of course, their camp would be well equipped with tents, pavilions, cooking impedimenta, everything which they would need. And the ordinary people, if you like, described by Froissart as the varlets and varlets, no doubt, made camp further down the hill, described as being around the marsh being, again, on the alluvial plain of the north bank of the River Reed, centred on what is now Greenchester's farm. And there was a narrow entrance at this point. The Scots improved on the wet and scrubby ground by cutting down trees and building timber defences, abattis, in order to deny any attacker an easy entrance into the camp. Most of the captured cattle were or would be grazing in or around the camp, and these people who were further down the social scale did not have tents as such. They normally would make bothies or bivvies out of branches and leaves. There were plenty of those around. It was a hot summer. Many of Douglas's officers were in favour of retreating to Scotland, forgetting about Otterburn. But Douglas hesitated. He obviously wanted to take Otterburn. At the same time, there is a suggestion he was offering Percy the chance to come up with an army and engage him again in some kind of great Homeric duel. Personally, I think this is perhaps a little far-fetched, and we shouldn't go too far in imputing chivalric motives to these people. These were hardened, tested soldiers. These men knew what they were doing. Douglas's plan, and he had made a plan, was very straightforward, it would appear. My take on that was he would effectively invite the English to attack the camp, which was far more visible from the road than the higher camp at Greenchester. And his men, at the same time, would execute a flanking move, allowing the contours and the existing woodland to shield their approach. They would outflank the English from the north and fall upon their own flank, their exposed right flank, as they were engaged against the camp. Hotspur, being impetuous, seems to have obliged. On the day of the battle, be it the 5th or the 19th, his men, perhaps 6,000 strong, we don't really know, had covered the full 30 miles from Newcastle. That's pretty impressive. Of course, the men wouldn't be marching, they would be riding on small ponies and horses, and the gentry would have larger and better horses. They wouldn't fight on horseback, but they would certainly ride to the battle. Even so, over medieval roads, even summer, that's a pretty impressive logistical feat. Of course, the old road did not follow the line of the new completely. Both English and Scots would have covered the ground from Cambo across up to what is now Elsdon, down past Davy Shields, back down toward the Tower and the line of the current A696. It was probably getting on for dusk, that would fit, given the army marched 30 miles, when Percy approached the Scottish camp. There's a great military maxim which says that no time spent in reconnaissance is ever wasted. Now, Percy doesn't seem to have taken a lot of notice of that because he didn't do reconnaissance. He wanted to strike fast and hard. He was frightened mainly that the Scots seeing his force, would simply break camp and slip away in the night. He therefore wanted to capitalize on the asset of this surprise and attack the Scots straight away. Now, there's a certain logic in that. The problem was that he didn't have a good idea, firm idea as to where the Scots were located, nor, as the light was failing, would he be able to use his longbowmen to their greatest effect. Now, the English warbow was the great battle-winning weapon of the era. Where the English were allowed to deploy their bows properly, the Scots were inevitably decimated, as they had been at Duplin Moor, Halden Hill, and Neville's Cross, and would be again in 1402 at Holden. What does seem likely is that Percy clearly split his force. And here there is a fair bit of disagreement. Did he send Umfraville, Ogle, and Redmayne on a wide flanking move to the north to attack the higher Scottish camp of Greenchester? Or did he simply tell them off as an independent brigade to barrel straight on ahead and attack the lower camp by Greenchester's farm? All inherent military probability, if I dare raise that particular possibility, would suggest that it was the latter alternative which he went for. It made good sense. Sending Umfraville on a wide skirting movement, which would have been over 3.5 miles across uncertain ground and failing light, would have been pointless. Also, inevitably, he would have collided, you would think, with Douglas, who was attempting the same maneuver in reverse, but on a much tighter circle. The ground favoured this. As I mentioned, the contours and the existing woodland and trees shielded Douglas's flanking movement. It seemed very likely that he and March had calculated that the English would attack the lower camp, and that the camp would effectively pin them in place, whilst the Scots then delivered a devastating flank attack. As ever in the heat of battle, nothing ever goes quite according to anybody's plan. Ogle, Redmayne, and Umfraville, on the left, did attack the Scottish camp. And Douglas was hoping that the light infantry and skirmishers who were in the camp would be able to hold their own until such time as he could reinforce their line with men at arms sent from the higher camp. And for a while, certainly, the camp was held. Reinforcements were fed in, but ultimately that wasn't enough. The defenders broke and ran and were pursued northwards across the country and up the line of the current road for a considerable distance. This took Redmayne, Ogle, and Umfraville, though, out of the battle. So there are two battles going on here, one on the English left and one on the English right. Hotspur's division is meantime attacked in its flank by Douglas, and a furious melee develops. Accounts say that the battle was fought under fitful moonlight. Perhaps, we don't know. It was certainly confused. And for a while, neither side seemed to gain the advantage. Douglas, however, putting new heart into his men, led a personal charge, using the charisma of his name and of his fame as a knight to inspire his men. Unfortunately, in the haste to arm when the English were seen, he'd forgotten to put on his helmet, and as a result, he suffered a number of injuries, including head wounds, which proved fatal. Douglas died before the battle was over. But victory on that flank of the battle went to the Scots. It doesn't seem to have necessarily been a rout. The survivors of Percy's brigade seem to have made a reasonably ordered retreat, and possibly there were rear-end actions being fought all the way back as far as Elsdon, which might explain some of the reference to Elsdon as being a site of the battle. Percy himself, however, was captured, as was his brother Ralph, who was so badly injured that blood was streaming from his greaves, it is said. So the fighting ended with the Scots victorious, though they had lost their commander. Losses on both sides are impossible to ascertain. It is said each side lost around 500 men, perhaps, the English rather more. Tantalizingly, it is said that when the nave of Elsdon Church, where the flags were lifted in the 19th century, something like 1,000 skeletons of young men, some of which showed battle damage, were found below the floor of the church. And it's suggested, and it seems not unreasonable, that these were the dead from the Battle of Otterburn. So one of the key questions is, how were the bodies transported from Otterburn to Elsdon? Normally the dead would be buried where they fell. Charles Wiesencraft, in a very well-argued paper in the 1980s, suggested that the battle was actually fought at Elsdon and not at Otterburn. And whilst this is a very interesting argument, it's one that would take us rather a long time to explore. But this remains one of the questions of the battle. Was indeed Otterburn the right location? If so, what were the movements of the various bodies of troops on the night of the battle? Did the English attempt a left-hand or right-hand flanking move? I tend to think it has to be left-hand, and that Umfraville, Ogle, and Redmayne were so carried away by their own pursuit that they were in no position to assist their other comrades under Percy, who at that point coming under considerable pressure. The English being denied the use of their warbows clearly would have an effect. But the good news is there's an awful lot of questions to answer, and hopefully we might find some answers to questions. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoy, and we look forward to talking to you again.